From the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, this is NATO 2020, a new podcast series pitching fresh ideas for the world's oldest military alliance. I'm your host, Terry Schultz, and I've been covering NATO a long time, so I know a lot about how it's been doing things, but this series is about how it could be doing things better. The Atlantic Council commissioned a series of 20 recommendations as to how the 70-year-old alliance could freshen up a bit heading into the next decade. Some of these are ideas we've heard before and some are brand new, but they're all aimed at helping NATO become more responsive and resilient to the threats that definitely get more creative all the time. I'm digging into the ideas with their authors, and this week the recommendation is for NATO to design a digital Marshall Plan. The authors are the Honorable Ruben Gallego from Arizona and the Honorable Vicky Hartzler from Missouri. And today we're joined by Congressman Gallego. Thanks for making time. I know you just ran off of a vote and have to run back to another one, so we're really happy to grab you for a few minutes here,
Thank you,
Congressman.
Terry. Thank you for having me.
So this was a proposal that was really juicy for me because, of course, China is becoming more of an issue all the time, both inside NATO and inside the European Union, of course, as well as over there in Washington. So there is a lot to talk about with your proposal. Sort of give me the elevator pitch. You're used to getting them, not having to give them probably, but just lay out for our viewers and listeners where you're coming from with this idea.
Well, look, the genesis of this is very simple. We understand that China and how they operate on a whole government approach, which means that even private businesses aren't really private, and they all have a responsibility to the state. They all have to answer to the state. They all have to provide information when the state creates it, right? So with the advent of 5G, we're in a very precarious situation where there only are so many 5G providers, and because of China and its scale, Huawei has a potential to really have a huge footprint to the point where it can actually crowd out all the other potential supporters. Now, why does that matter? Well, 5G really can get into so many areas that are just both in the civilian as well as the intelligence as well as the military side, or where they all kind of all intersect. And so if we know, and you know, I don't have to spill any secrets here, we know that China, when they believe if they ever go to war with the West, that the first thing they have to do is win the information war. It's very hard for us to believe that they won't use their access to the 5G network as a tool and as a weapon, right? So knowing that, and I started talking to a lot of our friends across the Atlantic about this, encouraging them to make sure that they kept their information separate from Huawei or not vulnerable at least to 5G intrusion from Chinese companies. But the one thing I kept hearing all the time was like, well, this is too expensive, right? Or it'll be cheaper if I do this. Or, well, I want to split it up and do this way, and I'll do, for sensitive sites, I won't do Huawei, but for non-sensitive sites, I will use Huawei because there's no other way I can pay for it. Or some places they're like, I can't just rip everything out and start from the beginning. Well, in all things being truthful, everyone has to take care of their own interests. And, this is a very expensive endeavor. So this is where the idea came up, was that we as an alliance should come up with a digital plan, a Marshall digital plan, to help each other out. Now, what does that mean? Well, it could serve in a couple of ways. Number one, we learn about best practices, right? Now that we see how some countries are implementing 5G in a manner that's safe for them and safe for alliances, why not help that, help export that knowledge to other countries, so that way they know that this is a way to do it, so that way they don't have to, go through the steps and process of learning new ways about how to implement a good 5G tech program, right? The other ideas is we could also help people buy things in scale, right? Hardware themselves can be expensive. What about when everyone joins alliances and starts buying things together, right? And that way we can actually have some leveraging power. I do think at some point, I don't mention this in my write-up, but I do think at some point there should be some low interest loans to countries that want to redo their 5G network or upgrade their 5G network, as well as to private companies that want to operate in this space that are separate and free from Chinese influences. Now,
okay, let me hop in here. Let me hop in. I get to ask some questions here, Congressman.
Go ahead.
That was a long elevator ride. No, okay, but
we're going up the Washington Monument here.
Exactly. Okay, so I'm buying. I think we were walking. Okay, so I'm buying into some of this, but you did in fact wrap up quite neatly the arguments that the Europeans have. But we should point out from the beginning that another of the arguments, which you didn't quite mention, was that there is not truly a European or American alternative to Huawei that was at least Ericsson and Nokia haven't caught up yet to, and that's another one of the arguments that the Europeans had, was that this was the most advanced. This was what was giving them the best technology, the fastest technology. They were getting ahead of the game by using Huawei components. But you did, I mean, as you pointed out, to rip out the system would be very expensive. They didn't have anything equitable to replace it with at the moment. I mean, that's changing all the time. But the other thing that we should say from the beginning, before we get into how exactly it would work, is that the Europeans are of very different minds. And you know from talking to them that you've got a huge range of countries like the UK that are completely on board. And then have
Hungary, who's on their own,
zero on board. I mean, Belgium, where I live, I think it was 100% Chinese technology in its as it was getting its 5G system underway. Germany has reinforced again and again that it is not willing to completely ban Huawei. And the other thing I will lay out before I pop it back to you is that in the European Union, these are national decisions. So the EU, you might get all of the EU leaders on board to say, yeah, this is dangerous. Yes, we would prefer that our member states don't use Huawei. But you go back to the governments like Hungary, and they can make their own decisions on this, and the EU can't do anything about it. So how do you approach that? I mean, and I would point out that this is just kind of amusing that a Democratic congressman from Arizona sounds like Mike Pompeo on this question. There's very little difference between the Pompeo State Department, who came over and really bullied governments, and your approach.
Well, look, national security, I think, has a bipartisan appeal here in the United States. And look, this is not a bullying approach. This is an approach that I think encourages collaboration, encourages finding ways to basically leverage joint buying, learning from each other. We've done this before as NATO, right? We've helped each other out. We've had unified understanding of what kind of weapon systems we should have in terms of interoperability. So this is just the next level of war fighting that we could potentially find ourselves in. Now, what happens if you don't want to work within this system, right? Well, there's nothing we can do. Obviously, every country has to act differently, but we and I've been very clear with a lot of other members, both Democrats and Republicans, that where we find vulnerabilities, we're going to have to also, of course, reinforce our own networks within those areas, right? And that may end up causing a lot of friction between countries that we don't need it, right? And lastly, I know I hear this argument like, well, Huawei is the only player in town, or Huawei is the cheapest player in town. If we let Huawei have dominant market, it will be the last deal in town. Ericsson will never be able to, grow off the ground. Neither will Samsung. And so we'll find ourselves in a situation where they will end up being the only people that we can buy from, and these countries will be able to buy from. And I think that's a very dangerous situation.
But haven't allies sort of painted themselves into this corner by not investing in their own systems at the same rate that, China poured money into Huawei?
Well, look, at this point, we can't have every country doing their own systems, but we can go with trusted systems. We know that Ericsson is a trusted system from a trusted country. We know Samsung is another trusted program. And I think that we as again, with buying power and being able to bring some of these technologies to market and scaling them up, we'll be able to compete against the Chinas of the world, right? If we are able to do this, it's not just China that we can bring in. We can also bring in India, a lot of the Southeast Asian countries that don't want to have that much, Chinese tech presence in their systems. And we could really bring a lot of them up to the scale to compete with Huawei. But if we allow them to take full control, we'll never be able to get it back.
But what would you do now if you're asking them? I mean, like the UK going back and pulling out components, and what the Europeans are expected to do now. I mean, are you slowing them down technologically if they can't use Huawei? I mean, is there a price to pay, a price to pay in progress if you don't use Huawei at this very moment?
Well, look, there's a price to pay in security too. I mean, this is all a balance that we have to figure out. You know, we're not worried about China coming all the way across and invading, Europe, but we do have to worry about the confluence of Russian and Chinese interests, and the fact that if you have too much Chinese tech in the civilian infrastructure, we could have a situation where Russia's crossing one of the planes, and by the time we can, cross one of the rivers because we have no control over the bridges or the harbors, this is already a game over situation. So this is why we have to think about the cost benefit analysis, right? Yes, it may cost more, but we're willing to also help, and again, to try to reduce those costs through coordination, to collaboration, buying in bulk, things of that nature.
Well, let's go more specifically to your Marshall Plan approach to this. So your idea is that, as I wrote my notes here, allies with vulnerable networks would be grouped with those on the cutting edge to determine the risks of the Chinese 5G infrastructure and to find innovative ways to finance alternatives. So how would that work? And are you talking about doing that within NATO or outside of NATO?
It doesn't have to be within NATO. I mean, I think within NATO and within the EU, there's a lot of relationships that are helpful and beneficial. But we've seen actually other situations of creative financing to blunt Chinese influence. For example, you have a lot of Japanese government bonds that are helping build electro hydro sites in Southeast Asia to stop really Chinese influence over some of these hydro sites, right? So you could see that type of work. But ideally what you would have is, for example, some of these more technologically advanced European countries teaming up with some of these countries that are still trying to move into that direction, that may not have the technical wherewithal to actually be able to move into the 5G or to redo their 5G, right? So you're basically borrowing the brain power and avoiding the labor costs of trying to bring in the technicians to do that. But number two, yes, there needs to be some level of financing this. I am very realistic of the fact that this will cost some countries money that they don't necessarily have, nor do they want to have to make the analysis whether they should spend this on the civilian side versus the military side. And this is where I think there can be some support, like I mentioned, between what we said between Japan and some Southeast Asian countries.
Well, I mean, if you hop over to the EU side instead of the NATO side, there are structural funds. There is money, from the central pot for the poorer member states they're net takers, and they can use this money to build up their networks if they need to.
Absolutely.
But how would the buddy system work? I mean, they're already in the EU and in NATO, most of them. So what sort of structure would you add on top of that in this idea?
I mean, I don't think you have to really redo the wheel. We have relationships that go back decades now between many countries. And you just have to really, I would say that at most what you have to have is a willingness between, some of your better adapted countries to some of the ones that want to get there. Having the Czech, for example, have probably one of the best, more advanced, systems when it comes to the 5G that we're very happy with, right? Having the Czechs team up with maybe Poland, some of these other nations that they have a better relationship with, and teaching them some of the do's and don'ts they've gotten to the point where they are, I think would be really helpful. Now, you have some countries that just are not ever going to work in that way. Hungary with a lot of its neighbors, for example. But there is possibilities there that we need to do the best that we can with the knowledge that we have and with the technology that we have.
Well, where is the EU missing the boat on this then? Because as you surely know, they ordered all countries to come up with, to take 6 months and look at where their biggest vulnerabilities were, and then take another 6 months and reveal how they would fix those vulnerabilities, specifically to Chinese technology. So, how is that? How would you reinforce this in a ways that aren't already happening?
Well, I don't necessarily want to say that this is EU's problem and that they haven't done it, or NATO's problem. I actually think that it's been a lack of leadership among the Americans in America in terms of this. We should be taking I think our approach has been more ham-handed, heavy-fisted, and I think this requires us to be more sophisticated, more collaborative, and really working in a manner that's respectful of the EU and NATO and their position and what they're going through and dealing with. Again, as much as I agree with a lot of the goals of Pompeo when it comes to the 5G vulnerability, the manner in which they did it, I don't think got us the allies that we needed. And I think that we need to kind of re-engage this and re-engage Europe and re-engage NATO in a manner that I think will be more collaborative and have better outcomes than just trying to force the ball through.
It's a better time than ever in some ways because of the disinformation campaigns linked to the coronavirus pandemic, because the EU was really shocked by how aggressive China was. I mean, Russia also, but if we're talking about China, how aggressive China was in its disinformation campaigns and trying to tear down the EU by reputation. So in some ways, I think that the Europeans will be more open to this than they would have before, perhaps, a bit of a wake up call. But on the other side, they just signed this new investment agreement with China, and they may want to, try to preserve some goodwill. Have you taken that into account? I mean, this was just signed just before the Biden administration took office.
Yeah. I mean, look, we've definitely seen, I think the opening that Europe is doing to China, China's doing an opening. But it's not we can't treat every interaction as a threat, and all that would do is push away our potential friends and allies. And I think as long as we continue to have these conversations, an understanding of where we all want to go, I think we're going to be in a good spot. There's no way that we can deny, the number one economic power of the world in terms of the European Union, access and work with China, a growing emerging power that would be not beneficial to the European Union, wouldn't be beneficial to China. So we have to be realistic about that. At the same time, you can have two separate conversations happening at the same time. One that respects our conversation when it comes to 5G and where we should go together as a transatlantic partnership, and what EU wants to do in terms of their economic relationship with China.
Would you agree with the threats that were made earlier to cut off information sharing with countries that continue to use Huawei technology? Because, of course, if it's an open sieve, then, things that the U.S. shares could conceivably make it to Beijing pretty quickly.
Absolutely, depending on the severity of the case, right, and depending on how well your network is. Now, this is the beauty of what I want to do with the Digital Marshall Plan. You have a lot of countries that are operating in the gray right now. They don't know where exactly they need to be in order for them to be compliant with what we feel are safe, intel sharing. It's better that we actually have this coordinating efforts that they know exactly what they can do and maybe what they can't do. But at the end of the day, we do have to take care of our own self-interest. We are not just responsible for the intelligence of the United States, but obviously we're the center and conduit for a lot of the free world's intelligence. And so we can't make ourselves vulnerable, especially if there's a country that has not taken the steps or is not willing to take the steps to do that. Now, that's not just 5G, though. We do that with almost any other type of system that we use when we're sharing intelligence across countries.
And how would this mesh with the Clean Alliance that's already in place, where the U.S. was trying to get countries to sign on to a pledge not to use this kind of technology?
Well, again, the pledge is one thing. This is more than incentives in terms of coordination, finding the technical wherewithal, collaboration, all those things, right? So it's one thing to sign something and say we're not going to do it, but it's another thing to actually give the incentives and the tools to actually do there as well. Hopefully, eventually, the financial incentive to do it too.
And you do mention in your paper some suggestions for financing, but when we're talking about the richest country in the EU, Germany, not having the mindset to do this, it's not a question of financing primarily, is it? Do you think that would just make it more obvious how much the U.S. is willing to invest in this idea, or would that sweeten the deal, make it seem more like allies working together? I mean, it's not really a question of money, is it?
Well, I think unfortunately for some countries it is a question of money. Let's be honest. One of the things I will be honest, when I wrote this, we were still under the Trump administration, and with a controlled Senate and of Republicans. So I never thought that we could ever, get back to the point where we could do some type of lend-lease program or any type of program of this nature. But I think right now it actually would be a prime time for the United States to engage in this. Our borrowing power is very high, our interest rates are very low, and I think we could really step into that function, especially for these smaller nations, because what may be to them a vast investment, for us is probably not that much.
And the goodwill right now is a commodity you couldn't buy right now with the Biden administration if you're going to have an initiative like this. And this has been true of so many of the things that we've talked about here.
It's also a great way to bind us again, too. There's no way that we can deny that there hasn't been a fissure between our transatlantic partners and the United States with questioning about whether we are committed to that relationship. I think this is just another great step that President Biden and his administration can do to really help bind that relationship again that was so strong for so many years.
Has it been frustrating in a bipartisan way how slow Europe has been to see this the way the U.S. does, the threat from China, the potential leakage of information, seizure of information, however you want to describe it?
Yes, I mean, it has, to be honest. And my colleagues and I talk about this, especially on the Armed Services Committee, because we get the global perspective and we get the threat analysis all the time. And we know what China is doing. They are voracious about gathering of information and trying to use it, or hold it and use it whatever time pleases them. And we know where they want to go for the next 30, 40 years. So I think partly it's also because we've had such a strong relationship with NATO that, when we don't see what we anticipate would be reactions that we thought should happen when we have a mutual threat, it does frustrate us. Now, hope springs eternal. I think we have a good opportunity now with this administration. I think I think China has shown its hand with their misinformation campaign around COVID. That hopefully that will all bring us together.
And you say that you will be advancing this concept in the next Congress. So tell me what your next moves are on that side of the pond to get more attention for this idea, to push it forward, to present it to the European allies.
Well, so number one, I'm going to try to introduce some level of this program to the Armed Services Committee. Probably a study first to see if this is something that's viable in terms of the financing portion of it. I'm going to talk to the Biden administration about this and ask them to actually look at this idea as part of a potential policy. And then hopefully when COVID is done, I can get over to Europe and talk to our European allies about this idea and see what they think and see if they could give us an input back on this.
Well, big meetings are planned. We've got the G7, the summit. The summit where President Biden is expected to come. NATO and the EU both want to meet him. So, you've got a couple of months prep time now before everybody is going to be throwing all their ideas at him.
I'm getting ready as it is. And I apologize. They just called votes, too.
I know you got to go. Okay. Thank you so much, Congressman Ruben Gallego from Arizona, for sharing your recommendation that NATO design a digital Marshall Plan. And thanks to our audience. You can find all 20 ideas at atlanticcouncil.org and tell us what you think on Twitter at #StrongerWithAllies. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.